Hello and welcome to another edition of the Halcyon podcast. My name's Lorne Risley, going to be your host for this episode. So, on this edition, no timestamps needed. You know who you are and why that's relevant to you. Let's talk about something I care deeply about, but no one else gives a flying fuck about, which is why I know this podcast is going to be super popular. Twitter arguments, Twitter debates, presentation of ideas, confrontation of those ideas, consensus reaching, attempting to try and broach subjects and breaching people's ideas in order to better understand them and progress subjects and topics. Right, so, context. A few weeks ago now, actually, I dived in on the Battlefield 5 controversies 1 and 2, i.e. the cover causing offence to various individuals and the statement made by an EA creative executive on the game who subsequently quit, which again caused some level of controversy within the gaming community. Now, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about a specific interaction I had as a result of that. Now, typically speaking, my interaction on Twitter will range a little bit. I won't categorize them to an extent, but I'll give you a few examples of the kind of people that I tend to come across when I'm trying to discuss a topic with someone that I disagree with. Or at least there's some aspect of their argument or their statement that I disagree with, because I think that's an important distinction to make. Just because I agree with the sentiments of a person doesn't necessarily 100% agree. There have been numerous instances. I mean, the original example I give is the Scarlett Johansson situation, where I attempted to debate people, one specifically with respect to the inconsistency of their outrage and the inconsistency of the logic they employed. However, within the comment sections you get various responses, and some of them I just thought, come on now, what are you doing? Usually the kinds of things where you get, you're this, you're that. The one that I usually read and just go, well, you only said that because you're some kind of cunt, or something to that effect. And you go, two things. Number one, how is that even remotely constructive? Two, how does this concern you if that's your viewpoint on the person rather than the sentiments that they're echoing? And number three, do you really have nothing better to do than to sit on Twitter insulting people? Now, people might extend that argument to me by saying, well, do you not have anything better to do than going on Twitter and starting arguments or whatever they might categorize me as doing? Well, no. What I'm trying to do is engage with people. Trying to engage with their ideas, trying to understand their thought processes so I can at least empathize with them to a certain degree. However, coming back to the point, in that scenario, I disagreed with the lady I was debating fervently, and while we didn't reach a consensus in the end, we did have a mutual respect for each other that I'd like to think is echoed to this day. Haven't spoken to her since, but it was worth the interaction for the time because I felt that I had made a good point. I'd managed to confront her ideas to the point where to a wider audience, I think that it was pretty evident that I'd made the better of the points. She wouldn't necessarily concede it, but I like to think that the reason why she reached out to me after the fact was because that maybe she wanted to still reclaim some of her credibility, at least in my eyes, and for what it's worth, she did. She addressed the matter in a very concise, honest, and intellectually consistent nature, which I appreciate, because she didn't just resort to shouting me down. She didn't try to dispel me by using names or anything like that. Now, that's one instance that ended positively. You get other instances. You get instances where people go, "Ugh, stop talking, your opinion doesn't matter," or "Ugh, I'm so bored of this." And you go, well, hang on a second. You've seen it fit to voice your concerns about something that's offended you. Now you've got to answer for it to someone who, unfortunately, it seems, possesses an intellectual curiosity that you don't maintain. And that puts you at a disadvantageous position, because I'm the kind of sad actor that's going to look into a lot of this. I'm going to confront you with what I've found and ask you to justify your position, because unfortunately, just because you have the ability to voice an opinion and just because you're angry doesn't give you carte blanche to be a twat on the internet. which is why you should always be held accountable. If someone comes up to you in real life and says, why the fuck are you posting this, or why are you saying this, and your best response is, frankly, I hope that you at least have the forethought to revisit those posts and edit them or delete them, or at least have the courtesy to apologise for being such an idiot in the first place. That's the second type of character that you may or may... I don't come across those as often as I would think, but you do come across them nevertheless. Now, this is the third example on the topic of this particular podcast, and I warned a friend of mine to mute me for a couple of days on Twitter. I've never told anyone to mute me before, but I just worried that my timeline was going to get inundated with messages. So instead of going on using tweets, I direct messaged an individual. Now, it's worth pointing out right from the gate, I have no intention of naming this person because I've sensed a reserved let's put it this way. When I said, by the way, I'm a YouTuber and I'm planning to make content on this, the initial response was, please don't. My question is, why? And you go, because I'm asking you to. Now, I'm sorry. It's in my fucking tagline that I'm a YouTuber and professional agitator. I'll read it. Host of YouTube channels, 2 of them, The Halcyon Show and The Voracious Show, professional agitator. That's my fucking tagline on Twitter, and this guy is saying he's not read it. I've read everything about this guy. Probably said too much by saying he's a guy. Anyway. And it's also everywhere on my Twitter. I post videos every other week. My banner is me. My profile picture is me in front of a green screen. So I don't really know much more I can do to flag post the fact that I make content, and that I wouldn't use that medium to present my ideas in an uncensored way. Nevertheless, still said, would you mind not making a video? I said, look, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will not name you. I will not direct people to you. I will not directly reference the conversation that we had, and I will not read your responses verbatim. And I plan to hold to that promise. I will, however, use the conversation for reference purposes so that I can highlight a wider point that I feel needs to be made and isn't being made at the moment. Because in the society we live at the moment and the online culture that we have, it's an extremely popular tactic for someone to just pick a side. Don't you dare think intellectually or individually about something. You are liberal, you are conservative, you are alt-right, you are radical left, you are this or you are that. You are not allowed to hold opinions that are inconsistent with a wider viewpoint. If I'm for instance against gun control, which I'm not actually, by the way, I'm an advocate for gun control. I've heard a few debates recently that would discuss gun control like it's something that would never work, and you go, yeah, okay. Anyway, debate for another time. Riding off into a tangent. Let's stay on the point. I hold views that are simultaneously conservative and liberal. I hold views that wouldn't necessarily conflate with others, but are certainly difficult to reconcile, but I hold them nevertheless, because I have to look at each subject through the prism of what is true, what is false, what is fact, what is fiction, and what I believe to be true in my eyes based on what I've observed and the arguments that have been presented to me. I don't necessarily subscribe to a bunch of opinions from one person or another based on what tactical advantage they may hold in the wider battle for supremacy that the political landscape seems to be embroiled in right now, and has always been to a certain degree, I'd argue. So, this podcast is about a specific type of response that this individual has exhibited on Twitter, which is, and I would categorize them as a libertarian or a liberal individual. Someone who should be for the advocacy of free speech, someone who should be erring on the side of what I would consider to be quote-unquote right. I think a lot of people have made the misconception that being a libertarian or being a liberal means that you err on the side of moral authority, and that's not necessarily the case anymore, and here's why. So this gentleman, again, not directly referencing him, but Twitter is Twitter, it's in a public format, came to my attention during a Twitter conversation with an individual who'd made some flippant comment about the Battlefield 5 debacle, which I was attempting to try and at least confront him on some of his ideas and at least understand how he arrived at the conclusion by just at least presenting him with a couple of quotations after asking his opinion. However, the gentleman that interjected himself into the conversation within, I want to say 10 minutes. I'd have to look back over the Twitter conversation to be 100% sure, but it was a relatively short amount of time, had tweeted both of us, because obviously we're in the conversation, at least 10 times. Maybe a few less, maybe 7 or 8. And these tweets consisted of, the first one I remember distinctly being a gif of Mark Hamill from Star Wars The Last Jedi saying every word you just said was wrong, and then proceeded to tweet various pieces of information that he had sourced and presented to this gentleman, the original gentleman I was debating, as facts, summarizing with something to the effect of, you should apologize for your beliefs and you should also be thanking me for the presentation of these arguments. Now, I attempted to address this gentleman directly on Twitter via tweets, which didn't go too well, so he invited me to direct message him. So I did. My direct message, and I will quote this verbatim because I think it sets up the argument quite nicely. It sets the scene as to what I was trying to get upon. So, to follow up on this is the first message, I'll omit the first part because it references his name. To follow up on my conversation with you the other day, I wanted to pick up on the point that I feel has been left somewhat unanswered. I still don't understand the ploy of being overly aggressive in your presentation of your ideas, when that has the typical effect of entrenching people in their preconceptions, especially when you yourself made the assessment that people will either accept your views or they won't, and they are therefore not worth engaging with. So can I ask, what has led you to believe that when you bombard people with the message, you are wrong, you must accept my point of view, is the best way to broach subjects that require nuance and deconstruction of arguments, such as with the not my battlefield argument? Now, again, not quoting it verbatim. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 messages later. Does that not highlight the point I'm trying to make with him? You can't bombard people with information like that. His point stems from the idea that he is not debating people. He's presenting them with facts and they either choose to accept them or they don't. If they don't accept them, they're not worthy of his time, or at least he's not inclined to waste, quote unquote, his time debating them. I can understand a jaded nature being the source of this thought process, because I would imagine that this gentleman at one time or another probably did try to confront people with ideas and ask them to at least concede some of their point of view in an attempt to reach a consensus, and was met with probably a lot of resistance, if not outright denial of his stance. I can certainly appreciate that. I certainly sympathise with that. But do you think I haven't? The Adam Blompier situation is one that still irks me to this day, because I still feel that my point was valid. Now, if I'd go back and revisit that conversation, there probably are a couple of things I'd do differently now with the benefit of hindsight, but broadly speaking, I stand by my point. The Scarlett Johansson situation, again, I feel I'm somewhat validated, not necessarily by the amount of response that I got, but by the conversation I had with the individual. The fact that we were, in the end, able to reach a degree of a consensus, even if we didn't necessarily agree. And she conceded a couple of points, I cede a couple of points. Even if I believe I'm right, I still have to try and reach a consensus, because that's the only way you move forward with things. That's the only way you move forward. I think the second you set your stall out to say, I am 100% right, okay, if you've convinced yourself of that, fair enough, but that doesn't mean that you're automatically going to convince anyone else of that. Now, if your goal is to convince people, you have to, it's a bit like the advice I give people when going in for, if, let's say for the sake of argument, you think you're underpaid and you want to speak to the boss. So, yeah, I'm going to tell him he's got to earn something. Do you know what, actually, I'm going to take on the visage and the enunciation of a good friend of mine. You want to get a better paid job? Well, here's what you got to do. You got to set your stall out, you got to get your facts in order, and you've got to understand exactly what you're worth. But then you got to go in there and understand that you're not going to get what you asked for. You've got to set your expectations just that little bit lower, because otherwise, if you don't get what you asked for, you're setting yourself up for disappointment right off the bat. And that makes the whole enterprise a little bit worthless, doesn't it now? So, oh god, that was an awful impression. I feel sorry for you now. Anyway, the idea being that you can never reach a point where you're happy. You can reach a point where you're satisfied, though. That's true in that situation. It's also true in trying to change people. And that's genuinely what I try to do when I go on Twitter. I try to confront ideas that I think are false or somehow stupid, to put a real blunt term on it, and ask people to at least, right, explain to me. I'm going to give you the opportunity to change my mind here. I'm going to give you the opportunity to present your best case, because in your tweet, I could no offense. And on Twitter, I tend to be quite honest. On my podcast, though, fuck it. I'll say whatever the fuck I like. I can and have destroyed people on Twitter. The problem is, I'm not great one-on-one in person at being witty. Usually I have to get a couple of whiskeys in me for me to throw caution to the wind and go, fuck it, I'm going to say whatever the fuck I like here, and just go for it. On Twitter, I have time to think out my responses, and oftentimes I'll delete the tweet 2-3 times before I'm happy with it, and then I send it. So it means that a lot of the time I have time to think through my rebuttal to the point where I'm reasonably confident I'm right, because otherwise I wouldn't have bothered tweeting it. I'd have just said, yeah, fair enough, you're right. This gentleman, in this situation, does not see the wider point that I'm trying to highlight to him, which is this. Number one, you can't convince people of your ideas when you carry yourself with an arrogance and a certainty that is not befitting someone who is trying to change someone's mind. You can't humiliate people, you can't emasculate people, you can't insult people, and you certainly can't employ a moral authority that's unfounded and expect people to thank you for it. That's just not how people work. I'll give you an example. In the line of work that I do, let's say for the sake of argument, a customer brings in a vehicle and they have driven this fucking thing into the ground. They have run it dry of oil, they've been short shifting on every opportunity, they've dinged it multiple times, they've let the brakes run down so they're metal on metal, and they barely keep it with enough fuel to run from fuel station to fuel station. You bring it in and they ask you to fix it. What you don't do is tell them, oh, by the way, you fucking idiot, you did all this, baby, don't do it anymore. Because the natural human response to being told you were wrong or you were somehow stupid is one of aggression. I don't care what the situation is. It's always one of aggression and denial. But you forget that you have a desired effect that you are trying to achieve, which is why when you're a service coordinator or a customer service advisor or a receptionist or a call handler or whatever you happen to be, where you're going to deal with people in situations where they're not innocent, but you have a desired goal to achieve. In my case, repeat business, because that person, I want them to trust us enough to return to us as a business. You don't stick your grubby finger in their chest and say, yeah, fucking idiot, what are you doing? It does you no favours, it does them no favours. You construct your response for maximum effect. You have to do this. And it's the same with confronting ideas on Twitter. Now, this gentleman holds a different viewpoint than me. He believes that you cannot change people's minds once they've set. He, ironically enough, is an example of this. This is why, in particular, I wanted to highlight this gentleman, because this gentleman, on the face of it, is the kind of person I would see myself following on Twitter, reposting some of his images and reposting some of his sentiments and thoughts. He represents a good cause. But the way he carries himself, and the way he tweets, and the way he enunciates, and the way he supposes just tiny things irk me. They piss me off. Because they're the sort of, okay, I'm going to unhinge my jaw a little bit here. Because this is where I'm going to get nasty. This is where I'm going to get nasty, people. Yeah. If we're going to get into my other character, this is the not a nice character. Dusty Rhodes, R.I.P. Right. This kind of fucking argument, if you'd said it to me in person, I'd have looked you dead in your eye, my eyes would have widened, and I'd have said, say that a bit louder, so everyone can hear you now. Put on your big boy trousers and say it just that bit fucking louder. Because it's so flippantly disrespectful, patronising, and so arrogant that it would have been difficult for me to retain my faculties enough not to square up to this guy. Because what I can't understand is when you do have the moral high ground, as you did in this situation. I'm going to address you directly now because I promised this gentleman I'll send him a link to this podcast. Whether or not he listens to it is entirely up to him, but I promised 3 things, and that's the final thing that I promised. You will never understand, based on the responses and based on the opportunities that I afforded to you to try and at least reach consensus with me on a subject that did not relate to the original topic at hand. Just that maybe you are overly aggressive, and maybe the presentation of your ideas could be somewhat more elegant than just bombarding people with information and telling them to be thankful and that you're right. The fact that you weren't able to at least find the humility within you to do this means that I can't respect your stance on any other matter because I know how you present your ideas. It doesn't matter if you're right. Because unfortunately, the how and the why matter as well. The why you're involved in the argument, of course that matters. In that particular instance, you were right. But the fact that you had to carry yourself with a certain amount of, well, this guy is almost, he's so stupid for voicing an opinion in the first place. Now I'm sorry, everyone unfortunately is entitled to their opinion. Everybody, and it doesn't matter how stupid it is. It's everyone's responsibility to educate themselves and inform themselves. I pontificate this on a regular basis. Just go back through my goddamn tweets when I talk about usage of the N-word, judging before evidence is presented, due course. All of these things require patience, nuance, and effort. So in this instance, all you had to do was say, well, hang on a second, sir, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but here's evidence to the contrary of your premise. I would argue that what you're saying is inaccurate and your outrage is unjustified. Does that maybe make you rethink what you're saying? I would imagine, and I would put money on it, that the response from the gentleman wouldn't have been to block him, which is what I'm told happened. I still had tweet conversations afterwards with the gentleman I was debating. Although it was much harder to have them because he associated me with that thread. That he'd been utterly destroyed. And for the record, he was. From that point onward, his arguments held no weight at all. But that wasn't the goal of my conversation. It isn't to quote-unquote win arguments. Because so I won an argument with one person. Congratulations. That doesn't change his thinking, it doesn't change his rationale, it doesn't change his approach to anything. The goal was always understand the idea, deconstruct it, present my idea and how it integrates with his, so at least we can try and reach some form of consensus. Whether it be consistency of outrage, consistency of the response, or whatever the case may be. Because I don't ask that people agree with me, I ask that people take the same tact to get there as I have. Because I've often considered more than one perspective, because I've always argued. If I can't argue for the other side of my debate, so say for instance in the Battlefield 5 argument, if I'm not able to adequately argue their side, I don't understand them enough to debate them in the first place. That's why I ask questions. That's why I build a consensus. But why I build an understanding of what they're saying and why before I take them on. Always. I'll pose questions. I'll make statements from time to time if I feel that I know enough about the argument to do so. But you never bombard people and shout them down. It never works. It never has, and it entrenches people. And I'll tell you why. Because the Blompier situation was a classic example of this. No fewer than 3 or 4 people. I can't remember how many actually. It was at least 3 or 4, because I remember tweeting one person, then the second, then the third, potentially a fourth, and maybe others with response to, well, hang on a second, why does... And it goes from there, and then you go, wait a minute, so now you're personally insulting me. Okay, that's going to win me over. And if your goal isn't to win me over, then what is your goal? If you think it's because you're tweeting to a wider audience, then I'm sorry, you're approaching it in the wrong way. It's just one of those situations where it entrenched me more in my way of thinking. Now, there have been times since where I can't even remember. I might have even directly messaged one of the ladies that I was debating at the time. They probably wouldn't see it that way. It's worth pointing out that this guy didn't see it that way either. He didn't see it as a quote-unquote debate. He saw it as, well, no, you tweeted in a public format. I'm entitled to jumping around. Yeah, but I tweeted you the definition of a debate, and that's what we were doing. So whether you define it as such, fair enough. But then you're a fan of history, you like reading, you like knowing facts, then pick up a fucking dictionary and understand the meaning of the word before you start telling me how you can interject yourself in a conversation that had nothing to do with you, and then decide to then chastise me in your direct messages to me afterwards for not understanding. Think, are you understanding this now? Is that easy to follow? Here's 2 words for you. Here's 2 words that I hope you take with you as a result of our interchange and on Twitter, because this is ultimately, this podcast is a response to not only the tweets that we had, but also our discussion. Grow up! This fucking idea that you get to speak down to people and hold moral authority. I'll be the first person to hold their hands up and say, I have no moral authority over anybody. None. I'm constantly learning, constantly having my mind changed about a lot of different things. Evidence presented to me that makes me rethink my rationale when arriving at a conclusion. Always. Always. You are so insecure in the idea that maybe presenting a better argument would have been a better way of approaching this situation, that you dismissed me as quickly as you dismissed them, and we agreed on the topic. That's how bad debate has become in Twitter, on YouTube, on social media, that if you're not in my camp, you're not worthy of my time. And if you're not my enemy and I can't directly target you, you're not worthy of my time. Because I agreed with this guy on the topic, but not its execution, I'm not an explicit enemy of his, but neither am I an ally, so why am I worthy of time or debate? Now he will probably say, having listened to this podcast, wow, this is awfully aggressive of you. Wow, I took time out of my day to message you. Yeah, 2 things to that. Number 1, you started it because you got aggressive with the other guy for no real reason. You got aggressive with me to a certain extent on our tweets and direct messages. You were certainly patronising and disrespectful when I'd always approached you. Even the response to being called sir. This always got me about customer service back in the day. You couldn't call someone madam for fear of that one woman in maybe 100 who turns around and goes, don't call me madam. Excuse me? It was a term used for a French brothel owner. Do not call me madam. And you go, it's a term of endearment, a form of respect I afford you because I don't know you personally. That's it. If you do not wish for me to use a term of endearment, that is fine, but that means I call you Margaret. It means I call you Jeff. Now, considering we don't know each other personally, I don't think you want me addressing you in such a informal matter, don't you? So to pick at that fabric, maybe understand the reason why I'm utilising it and its roots before you go pointing your finger in someone's chest and accusing them of being disrespectful, when in actuality, it's a social construct formed to try and offer you some degree of mutual respect, which you've not afforded to me. And it makes me angry. It makes me angry, this situation. Genuinely angry. Because it makes progressing the argument so hard. It's hard enough getting through to someone whose ideas I believed are flawed, whose sentiments and whose presentation of their ideas is flawed. In the case of the Battlefield 5 situation, people who were calling it a misaccurate representation of history, or citing EA as a company for telling fans not to buy the game when it wasn't. So when the historical misaccuracy, number one, it's a fucking game. It's a creative medium. It's a fictitious form of entertainment. It can do whatever the fuck it wants. I'll reference a tweet of mine. It could have been a Wookiee on the front cover of the fucking game for all I gave a shit. How is the game, and is the story okay? What's it like? Is it buggy? Is it glitchy? Does it have good mechanics? Is it fun? Does it implement anything new? Does it bring anything fresh to the genre? Not, hey, they've got a woman on the cover. Did you know that is a statistical anomaly that isn't actually consistent with my perception of the world as it was in World War II? Get the fuck out of here! Who gives a shit? None of you are fucking historians. That's when it leads back into the uneducated quote, the EA developer who called them quote unquote uneducated and told them if they don't want to buy the game they don't have to. Right, read the quote in context first of all. It doesn't take long, it didn't take me long, it took me 30 seconds googling the article. Not a lot of effort, it probably took you longer writing your tweet of outrage and how to enunciate it than it did me googling it to find out, oh, that's not what he said and how he said it. But to be perfectly blunt, seeing as the linchpin's been pulled on my temper now, you are uneducated! By definition, you're uneducated! I have friends that went to university and studied this particular subject for 3 to 4 years. You couldn't afford 30 seconds to Google the fucking article that the quote was taken from, so how am I to believe for a fucking second you're an expert on anything that comes to something as mind-bogglingly complex and elongated and protracted as World War I and II? You mean to tell me I can believe you when you say that, nah man, women weren't on the front line, they weren't allowed to fight? There's so much I can unpack there. So much. Starting with, right, so you're a typical representation of a white male on the front of a cover. Number one, it hasn't been done to death. Number two, is historically accurate, but therefore any atypical representation of someone else on the cover leads to disrespect to the people that died in the war. And number three, that your only preconception is that only men from America and Britain participated, and therefore only white men participated. So we're not counting any black people or any people of minorities that participated from those countries. We're not including any other country that participated in the war that don't fit in with that demographic, i.e. like I've referenced in my tweets and other podcasts, Pakistan, India, Africa, Jamaica, to name a few. Their sacrifices are not worthy of embellishment on the cover. And then coming back to the fact that she's a woman, yeah, so let me understand this. If they're flowing through the trenches, the German opposition, and a nurse, or a carrier, or whatever, this woman who happens to be on the front lines, she's not going to pick up a gun and defend herself? Are you for real? The representation that she can't... Oh, but no, she's a soldier on the front cover. Yeah? You're telling me there were none whatsoever, with no background in studying history in the way that formations, battalions, squadrons, teams, units were formed. The individual stories that followed these battalions, squads and teams. Come on now. If you're outraged because you're pissed off that a woman is on the cover of your favourite shooter, and atypically that's been your escape from the fact that you are unlucky with women, to say the least, then I'm sorry to break this to you. That's not a good excuse. You need to find a better one. And then taken back to the uneducated quotation from the EA, the fact that it was EA made the statement. No one, it was one guy, one member of the team, and he called you uneducated because frankly you are, and he said if you don't want to buy the game because of the progression and the diversity that we're exhibiting, then don't buy the game. And frankly, I'll extend the same invitation to any motherfucker listening to this podcast who harbours racist, sexist, bigoted or otherwise views founded solely on hate and misinformation. I harbour no ill will to any race, creed or colour, and I've always pontificate the same thing. You judge people by the content of their character, not by their outward physical appearance, and what you preconceive of them. You're allowed to make any preconception you want, because you do, naturally. It's what your brain does. We're conditioned to do it as humans, as a safety mechanism. However, you can affect what comes out of your fucking mouth once you've had a chance to get to know them. And it's a responsibility you should take seriously. And so, as my PC dies from lack of power, so now I can't listen to my music anymore, here's the point I wish to make now that I've gotten good and right. I apologise to people that are listening at this point of the podcast. There's a couple of long-suffering listeners to this who probably don't like the idea of me getting visibly angry. And I apologise. It sometimes happens to me. It gets the better of me. My temper's not great. Again, it's why Twitter's a magnificent thing, because it allows me to temper my arguments and calm myself down from time to time. But in a long, rambling way, here's my point. If you're going to debate people and confront their ideas and present other ideas and other alternatives of thinking, here is my advice. Never be so fucking arrogant as to presume you're right before you've started because you haven't heard the other side. Yes, you are allowed to have your own ideas and ideologies. Of course, you are allowed to defend those with every logical piece of evidence and every idea that you have at your disposal, so long as you're not disregarding the arguments of someone else just because you don't like the fact that it undermines your own argument. That's not a valid excuse. I've had arguments of mine torn to shreds because it undermines my argument. But you have to have the humility to stick your hand up and say, I'm right. I will reference one right now. Cyril, Defunct Games. We've had a couple of Skype conversations over the last couple of weeks. Don't care to mention the contents, that's between me and him. However, there have been times where we have gotten into very, very long debates. Very, very long exchanges of ideas. And I've had to defend them. Of course I have to. I am a man. A bastion of masculinity and hardness. I shudder at the thought. Anyway. But I have later reconciled my ideas to the point where I go, he's right. He's right. Yeah, he's right. He tends to lean more liberally than me, and he tends to, whether or not he means to, agitates me just a little bit. I like that though. So, if I can find it within me to be human enough to acknowledge when I've maybe crossed the line, as I feel maybe I've crossed the line a couple of times on this podcast. Maybe my aggression has gotten me slightly the better of me. Maybe I should have given this guy a bit more credit for the moral standing with which he held and the position that he was taking in light of the conversation I was having with the first person about the Battlefield issue. However, I maintain that that tactic will never work, and has never worked. I maintain that anytime you enter a discussion in the public sphere, you are trying to change someone's mind, not prove you're right. Because if you are, then why are you engaging with people in the first place? You present an idea and then people will come to you. That's how it works. I would argue that the arrogance shown is something I suffer from time to time, which is why I always appreciate it if someone rings me up and say, hey, you're a little arrogant there. Hey, I think you might be wrong about that. Because at least then I have the opportunity to at least reevaluate my ideas. It happened with the Scarlett Johansson incident. Again, discussing it with the lady that I was discussing with, even a couple of other people who I had discussions with, made me think, maybe I was too fervent and maybe my ideas are too deeply entrenched. Maybe I do need to revisit some of them. It happens. It happens when you're in a debate and you're being defensive. No one likes being wrong. But that doesn't mean that you can't be wrong. And it doesn't mean that it validates every other thought that comes out of your brain ever. And I feel that this gentleman fears that fervently, has had many discussions where he has either lost or has not had the desired outcome and has found that being blunt and tremendously aggressive is the only way to attain what he believes is his end goal. And I don't resent, again, I want to reiterate this, I don't resent what he represents. I resent the way he represents it. And that's a big problem. Liberals on the left are becoming as fervent as conservatives on the right in terms of their ignorance. And I always have a problem with that. I also have a problem with people not allowing themselves to be wrong from time to time. Because we all are. We all lose debates sometimes, we all lose arguments. It happens. The way to deal with that is to bounce back. Having refined your argument, if you still feel you're right, and there's nothing wrong with feeling you're right, or at least amending your views somewhat to reflect the fact that you've taken on board what the other person has said. That's what a reasonable person would do. However, we live in an age of the internet where there's always someone around the corner who's willing to validate what you've said. Tricky to say the least. So what I wanted to say was, people, try and be open to new ideas. Try to be open to new concepts. Don't be so rigid as to not be able to accept new pieces of information, because then I fear you become as much of a part of the problem, even if you're holding the moral high ground. And we almost always operate from one of two stances: a moral superiority or a selfish sense of superiority. We operate for our own needs almost 100% of the time. It just depends on whether or not we're claiming to represent other people or we're claiming to represent ourselves. That's the only distinction. So when I hear people saying that they're not acting from a moral standpoint of, well, I think I'm right because it's the right thing, and you go, okay, cool, can you provide me with evidence? Can you back up your arguments? And it's, well, no, because you're stupid, or no, because you won't understand, or no, I've given you a fact and you've not immediately amalgamated it into your own ideas and thanking me for the prospect. Yeah, you bet your fucking ass I got an issue with that. And if we were in person, this filter of mine wouldn't have existed, and the conversation wouldn't have been as productive. Because I've told you, you're a fucking moron, and maybe you need to open your goddamn ears occasionally and see that if you did the equivalent of what you did on Twitter to someone in person, I'd call your ass a bully. Because you're shouting people down. You're not allowing them to express their ideas. You're not allowing them to counteract your ideas with evidence of their own. In that situation, I understand. The guy's argument wasn't valid, and he was coming at it from a position of selfish authority. Completely agree, but you did not help. That gentleman is now even more entrenched in his beliefs than ever now. Apply it to everyone in the world, and then what do? You've got a world more divided than you could possibly believe. And I would like for people to be more united than ever. I like to break down barriers of conversation. I like to I like to encourage people to speak their mind, even if they think the ideas that they might speak might not be palatable to me. Because oftentimes they're not. I don't agree with a lot of people on a lot of things. But I can still be friends with them because I can respect the way they approach things. The first lady I debated, I still have a tremendous amount of respect for her because she at least heard me out, she presented her own evidence, she retracted some things, she afforded me the same opportunity, and I took the same advantage. I afforded you that opportunity. And instead, you pretty much threw it in my face. And then when I warned you that I'd be using it as a topic of podcast, you retracted any, I don't want any part of it, I don't want to do that. Why? If you're so sure of your beliefs and you're so sure of the way you presented yourself, why would you be afraid of any criticism? It's the reason why when people pull me up for my show, the Halcyon show, and it happens a lot, when people will pull me up and say, you do YouTube, what's that about? Duh. Well, why don't you spend 10 minutes watching one of my videos and then come to me with a valid critique of what you've seen, rather than just laughing at the fact that that's how I choose to present my ideas and express myself creatively. I'm not even going to bother explaining it to you. I'm not going to bother indulging you, because you'll get it. Just give it time. So, to sum up this podcast, people, be cleverer. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. Don't read into my tweets. No one's got time for that. If you want to, though, at Lorne Risley, the Halcyon Show on Twitter, which I hope you're all following me on, by the way. I wish to thank a few people for prompting me to continue to do podcasting. At least for now, this is all I'll be doing on YouTube. I still have videos that I'm releasing that are pre-made, so don't worry, there'll still be plenty of videos on there. So be interacting with people, still comment, so as always, like, share, subscribe, comment. I respond to as many comments as I can, if not all of them, and I like to have conversations with people, so never be afraid to throw some my way. Please check out some of the other content creators in the description below. They're becoming more and more prolific by the day. They're worthy of your support and your adoration. To the gentleman I was debating, I would like to thank you for taking the time that you did in order to address me directly, and I would like to thank you for the time that you took in order to debate me. I apologise for the over-aggressive nature of the latter part of this podcast. My temper gets the better of me sometimes, however, I have to be able to call bullshit when bullshit is there, and I feel like I did that on this occasion. But if there's any hard feelings, You've got the comment section below. You've got my direct messaging in, and you also have YouTube. I would be thrilled to see your video response to my podcast. I'd be absolutely enamored. More to the point, because it gives me something else to respond to. Maybe we can start a YouTube beef. I don't know, I've never had one of those before. From what I hear from KSI and Logan Paul, if it culminates in a boxing match, hey, we'll both make some cheddar, brother. And I'd be all for that. Get me out of my current job and maybe give me some of that YouTube money. Anyway, I don't really want it to go into a boxing match. I don't really feel like being pulverised on live television, to be perfectly honest with you. Anyway, please like, share, subscribe. Check out some of the other content creators in the description below. Follow me on Twitter. This has been the Halcyon Podcast. I've been your host, Lon Risley. Take care of yourselves. And as always, I'll see you guys on the next episode.